On Friday, the 24th of July, 1885, in the morning session of the 142nd Wesleyan Methodist Conference, the proceedings were in full swing. Meeting in the Brunswick Chapel in Newcastle. It was the fourth day of proceedings, with Brunswick Chapel being on the right-hand side. During the morning session, after attending to some other business, the outgoing president, the Reverend Dr. Frederick Greaves, announced that during the past year he had received a complaint that the Methodist leadership in the Norfolk circuit of Swaffham were regularly placing a female local preacher on the quarterly preaching plan. Greaves thought this complaint ought to be reviewed, although some in the audience, no doubt suspecting the divisive debate that would follow, shouted, "No, no." Greaves, reading aloud a letter from the Swaffham superintendent, reported that the lady, who John very helpfully informed me yesterday was Mrs. Fulham, reported that she was, quote, the oldest local preacher on the plan, that she was 76 years of age and had been regularly preaching for 50 years. A brief debate did ensue, but given what many members felt were the obvious exceptional circumstances of the case, it was agreed to let the matter drop. The following week, however, during one of the final days of the conference, the Reverend G.W. Olver raised the issue again. It appeared that a misunderstanding had arisen. Conference's decision not to interfere with Swaffham's practices had been reported in the press and had no doubt been gossiped about in the corridors of conference, and had, quote-unquote, given rise in some minds to the impression that the conference was not opposed to the public preaching of women and was disposed to relax its original rule on the question. Just to be sure, the Reverend Olver proposed a motion that would clarify this point and make it clear that conference had no intention of relaxing its position on female preaching. Although the overall tenor of the subsequent debate, as I've been able to read it, was generally opposed to this instance of female local preaching, there was certainly a note of ambivalence and uncertainty that ran through the debate. Many members were not familiar with the 1803 ruling, which was still the current position on female preaching within Methodism, and urged that it be read aloud for clarity. Sensitivity to an elderly Methodist woman who'd obviously given many years of devoted service urged some to adopt a more moderate approach. And then there were a few voices who spoke out cautiously in favor of female preaching, including the Reverends Charles Garrett, J. Ernest Clapham, Hugh Price Hughes, and Thomas Champness. They urged that a moderate course be taken. We should take no further action, they urged. Ebenezer Jenkins, a former missionary to India and a staunch supporter of evangelism and female rights within Wesleyanism throughout this period, declared, quote, that God was pouring out his Spirit on his handmaidens and they should be careful not to hinder that. These voices ensured that a compromise position was reached in true Wesleyan fashion. Conference did indeed confirm its continued opposition to female preachers and reiterated the 1803 ruling to this effect, but with continued provisos and caveats, which reflected a continued reluctance to ban the practice outright. Thus, I would like to argue this debate shows that within grassroots Wesleyanism, there continued to be, first of all, some evidence of female local preaching at circuit level, and that it also showed that by the mid-1880s, there were a small number of Wesleyan ministers with positive views towards women's preaching ministry and what this could contribute to the life of the church. I think it's quite interesting that of the two voices raised in favor of Mrs. Fulham that day in August in 1885, two of them we know for sure are key players in significant new directions in late 19th century Methodism. On the right-hand side, we have Hugh Price Hughes, the Methodist minister, soon to be editor of the Methodist Times, founder of the West London Mission, Sisters of the People, driving force behind the Forward Movement, this movement to reach the unsaved masses in new urban centers through using mission halls and centralized mission buildings. On the left-hand side, we have Thomas Champness, former missionary to Africa, former district missionary in Bolton, now editor of the Joyful News, a weekly revivalist newspaper, and founder of the Joyful News Mission. passionate about reaching the unsaved, and keen to support rural Methodism. Both Hughes and Champness felt that the trained ministry was too expensive to take on the new responsibilities of the late 19th century, and that a lay ministry needed to be encouraged in some way, shape, or form. Full-time trained workers were essential for the work, and both of them were already in their own separate areas beginning to explore and experiment with using women in such circumstances. In 1887, Hughes sets up his Sisters of the People. Champness had already been supporting female preaching, which we'll talk about in a moment, at least from 1883, but probably earlier. He may have seen women working effectively when he was a district missionary in Bolton in the 1870s, and he certainly supports it throughout the pages of the Joyful News, which reports favorably on it almost really from its inception. Now, in setting up these organizations, neither man was really thinking about reviving women's involvement in local preaching along the lines of the Mrs. Fulham in Swaffham. Instead, what I would like to suggest is that their vision for women was really as a means of reaching out to the unsaved, and as such, for them to operate outside an ordained or sacramental context, like we would say is a requirement for ministry, for an ordained ministry. Their vision really was for women operating as evangelists and mission workers, and that they were to do this not on the side, but in a professional, full-time, paid capacity. In this, I would like to suggest they were reflecting the growing trend towards full-time ministry, the continued full-time lay ministry, I should say, the continued popularity of populist evangelism within the ranks of Wesleyanism, and the still significant, which Henry Rack and others have referred to as this rough Wesleyanism, or this a revivalist type of Wesleyanism, which flourishes particularly in urban centers in the South and in the industrial heartlands of the North. For female preaching had long been part of this evangelistic, revivalistic network. And there's lots of other historians who have explored the presence of female preaching within those circles in the 1850s and the 1860s. Because what I think is happening really in the late 19th century, and what we're seeing, is the emergence of a new breed of female evangelist. A middle-class woman, respectable, who preaches to mixed audiences, but not from the pulpit or on Sunday morning, who does so at the growing range of special revival services, chapel anniversaries, or other fundraising events, which will become such a feature of urban evangelicalism. And they were increasingly doing this, I would suggest, as a career. Let's be clear. These women were not really seeking, as far as I can see, access to a ministerial role or to a sacramental role. So I'm really not going to talk about how women can become local preachers within Wesleyanism. Instead, these women were really demonstrations of a popular but parallel profession, that of the professional female evangelist. And so what I want to talk about today is the emergence of this new brand of female evangelist, this sort of young single woman, frequently middle class, increasingly professional, and wanting to talk a bit about how their work emerges and how Wesleyan Methodism deals with it. Because on the one hand, while I think it's an interesting development, it also reflects the vulnerability of female professions at this time, and particularly the vulnerability of the female evangelist career. It really has an ambivalent impact, I think, at this time. It's unclear whether or not we can actually say that this is really where calls for ordination come from or not. So with this context in mind, then, I'd like to discuss and consider the emergence of female evangelists within Wesleyan Methodism, and in particular to examine the work of the Joyful News female evangelists' homes that were based successively in Halifax, Rugby, and Wellington between 1886 and 1903. Now, in other work that I have done on female ministry, and in other research that I've done looking at these and other women, my argument has long been that female preaching doesn't decline in the 19th century, and that this argument of decline and inevitable erosion is really, I don't think, quite the way that we want to look at it. Instead, I like to argue that women's public ministry is constantly reinvented in a process that I would like to start calling conditional continuity. At times it's bigger, at times it's smaller. At times it's more public, at times it isn't. At times it flourishes in some denominations, and at times it doesn't. But there's almost always a period in the 19th century when we can find a woman who is engaging in some measure of public ministerial activity. So, and I think John Lenton's work and with his databases has been incredible at really uncovering the actual number of women who have been engaged in this type of evangelistic activity. And John, I'm thinking your database, 400 women maybe you've come across, which at a conservative estimate. So I'd like to argue that these arguments, really popular perhaps 10 or 15 years ago amongst professional historians, that women's ministry dies out in late 19th century Methodism, really need to be reconsidered. So I hope that when we talk about the Joyful News women today, that we can begin to try and do that. And we can look a bit more at the way in which Wesleyanism is dealing with this new phenomenon. So this is my talk. And where we're going to go, and perhaps we will just go there now. So, as professional historians, you're always looking for a way to try and understand the emergence of a phenomenon. And so these are what I think at the moment are probably the big interpretations, the ways that we can understand female ministry in late 19th century evangelicalism. Of course, the first argument, feminization, really refers to this idea that comes from the women's movement and comes from the campaigns which women were embarking on in the 19th century to increase their visibility and acceptability across a whole wide range of different areas. So we see by the late 19th century women's growing access to property, their growing access to the political sphere. We can see their access to education. All of these things, I think, make for a natural environment for women's ministry to flourish. It's okay now for middle-class women to participate in a whole wide range of different aspects of life. So why not religion as well? And then we've got this notion of laicization, this notion where in the wake of the 1859 revival, there is an enormous growth in lay participation in denominational circles and a growing acceptance of increasing lay roles within a whole range of different denominations. Wesleyanism in 1878 allows laymen to enter conference for the first time. And so you can see then the growth of, particularly in urban centers, of lay-run ministries. John Kent, in his book, analyzes the Daily News' survey of religion in London in 1903 and shows the enormous popularity of this fringe Protestantism, this evangelistic, almost non-denominational activity, recording over 422 evangelistic halls, commanding 167,000 attendances, rivaling, indeed, Methodism and the Baptists in the capital at that time. So there was a huge growth, I think, in the lay movement. This must obviously, too, have given support and endorsement to women's activity as well. I just can't see how it could not have done. So third argument then, or way of understanding, is this notion of sanctification. And of course, I'm really talking about the holiness movement. Holiness is always something I've never really understood and have always wanted to stay well away from. But I've been struck over and over again when reading and doing the research for this paper at the importance of holiness ideas and holiness theology in encouraging women to step forward. We can think of Phoebe Palmer and then Robert Pearsall Smith's wife, who were popular holiness preachers in the 1850s and the 1860s. And the Methodist holiness networks, which emerged at this time, were very supportive of female preachers and female evangelists. The Reverend W.H. Tyndall, who I will talk about in a second, who founds the Southport Convention, is a huge advocate of female evangelists. Thomas Champness himself, a great advocate of perfectionism, is again another huge advocate of female evangelism. And so when William Tyndall's daughter, Hilda, writes a letter to the Joyful News arguing that women should become evangelists, she uses the language of holiness when she says, "We can only do this blessed work by putting ourselves entirely in our leader's hands and letting him provide us with the power." She talks about how, for many women, this might be too difficult a task to contemplate, moving into the public sphere in this way. Nothing will be too much, though, to do for him, she argues, who died that we might have life. And then she quotes a hymn. "Then when we before the throne, we stand in him complete, we'll lay our trophies down all at Jesus' feet." A clear reference to the holiness and the perfectionist theology, I'm sure, with which she was imbued. So I think sanctification and the growth of perfectionism within Wesleyan circles has a huge amount to say when we talk about the encouragement of female evangelism. And the fourth point is really what I want to talk about for the rest of my paper, is this idea of professionalization. And what we're really talking about here is something that historians have become very interested of late, which is the ways in which occupational groups emerge and establish their self-identity. Because there are a number of characteristic features of professional groups. So you can imagine that once teachers begin to get trained, they're anxious to protect the boundaries of their craft. They want to have agreed standards of entry. They would like to perhaps have residential training. They would perhaps want exams or qualifications. There might then be regulations on conduct. There might be then issues about pay, terms and conditions, all of these aspects of the professional life. To what extent are the Methodist women that I've studied engaging with this process of professionalization? To what extent do they see themselves, in essence, as professionals? And to what extent does Methodism actually see them in that way as well? So that's where the talk is going to go. But what I wanted to do was, first of all, is to try and give you a sense of how big this group is. Because I think when we often talk about female evangelism in the late 19th century, and I know John would confirm this, is it's quite hard to get access to really definitive figures. And what you end up doing is drifting through the Wesleyan press and looking at these sort of occasional references and wondering how much significance I ought to give each one of those. How representative is that reference in the articles? And I think it's really, really difficult to actually know how big a community we're actually talking about. 400 references is interesting, but it could just be exactly that. It could absolutely represent absolutely nothing more. So I think that, so what I thought I would do is that I would try and look outside of the impressionistic nature of much of the denominational press and have a look at government sources, in particular the census. Because nowadays with digitization and it's possible to find out far more about the number of women who are declaring themselves under the categories of a range of different occupations. And so under the 1881 census, you can see how the census divides the professional class. And you can see here that there is one category of the professional class which was known as the clerical professions. And you can see, again, I hope, that clergyman, Catholic priest, minister, and then there's this fourth category here, which I would like to focus on: missionary, scripture reader, and itinerant preacher. Okay, because this is obviously, some of these categories are exclusively male, And some of these categories are exclusively, by definition, female. But the missionary, scripture reader, and itinerant preacher category is potentially a site for both men and women to occupy. And so, being a bit of an idiot, I took the census returns from 1851 to 1911, and I charted the number of men and women within the category of missionary, scripture reader, and itinerant preacher, and this is what I found. And I said to my husband, well, that's kind of not surprising because the population just goes up. So these are only raw figures. But what it does show, and I think is so interesting really, is that by 1911, in fact, there are more women within this category of scripture reader, missionary, and itinerant preacher than men. And what's kind of interesting, too, is that in 1911, clearly recognizing that occupational groups are changing, the census enumerators take away the category of itinerant preacher, and they replace it with mission worker, which I think is really significant. Because I think that this is probably a huge growth area for women. And we certainly see the strong, if you looked at the raw numbers, you would see the real rise. But what's problematic, I would suggest, is that if we've got women operating under the census category of itinerant preacher, how many? Maybe there's only 3, and 5,900 odd are in fact doing something else. So once again, exploring the potential of new digitization, I went to Find My Past, which, as you know, the genealogical resource allows you to actually search each census by individual household return. And it also allows you to search by occupation. So I conducted a range of different searches using words like evangelist, preacher, minister, and so on and so forth. And you won't be able to see the figures when I turn the slide over. I'm warning you in advance. I'm almost positive. But that's the result. And so I want to explain this a little bit, just to show you that on the left-hand side, in very tiny print, are all of my categories that I used to search the Find My Past database for each censal year between 1851 and 1911. And then I charted the actual numbers of returns that I got for each category. There are lots of problems with this. The occupational search box is a very sensitive one. So if you searched for Wesleyan evangelist, you would not find women who had returned themselves as an evangelist. If you search for primitive Methodist local preacher, you wouldn't find a primitive Methodist preacher. Okay, so a single word would throw the whole search off. But nevertheless, what it does show is that it shows this growth in occupations that we saw at the national level in the previous slide, but it also shows the particular growth of women who declare themselves to be an evangelist. So in 1881, 38 women returned themselves as evangelists. In 1891, that number goes up to 158. And in 1901, it's 90, and again in 90 in 1911. And you can see underneath that I've included all the Methodist categories as well, because there are a growing number of Methodists who are equally willing to return themselves and give themselves the name, and I'll talk a bit about that more in a second. I then, and that's I think basically the only point I really want to make is that between 1881 and 1891, there is an enormous growth in the number of women who classify themselves as evangelists. Why and what's happening and what is the role that Methodism plays within this? Because it's clear that this number is by no means mostly Methodist. In fact, I think Methodists are quite a small proportion of this. I think Methodists are generally reluctant to take part or to declare themselves in this way, in the same way. So you probably want to know about the Joyful News mission a bit and what the women have been doing and how this all fits. So I will tell you a bit about that. Because, of course, I guess the point I was trying to make there really was that there's clearly a real interest and a growth and an opportunity there. So it's unsurprising, I think, that Wesleyans look to institutionalize that activity in and around about this time. Because it's true that that within Wesleyan Methodism, that the idea to organize female evangelism comes from two different angles. The first, and I think the most significant, is the influence that can be traced back to an influential and wealthy Wesleyan layman, George Clegg, who was a worsted spinning manufacturer, the owner of Hollingdrake and Clegg Mill from Halifax. A committed Wesleyan, born in 1840, he had become a local councillor and a JP and was a generous benefactor to the local Halifax Wesleyan cause. A founder member of Rhodes Street Chapel, built a mission hall on Meal Street, down the street from his own mill. But in the 1880s, it seems that he heard a female captain from the Salvation Army and was led to the blessing of perfect love. This holiness experience had convinced him that Wesleyans should have a very similar movement. And so he goes on to found a female evangelist's home. This home eventually is located at Gladstone Road. It moves to Kingsley Place. And by November 1887, had 6 women working for him that he was supporting. At the same time, Thomas Champness and his role in the Joyful News newspaper must have been aware of what Clegg was doing, and vice versa. And the two of them clearly get together. Thomas Champness advocates and promotes Clegg's mission in the pages of the Joyful News, and had long been developing his own work, which by 1889 was based here at Castleton Hall in Rochdale. Champness's mission with lay men was very popular. He had almost 100 agents by about this time. So but he also begins to support Clegg, and the two of them then go into partnership, really, and eventually, around about in the 1880s, 1890s, the home is renamed. And what we can see is that in the pages of the Joyful News here, that underneath a very long list of male evangelists, that at the very end, prayer is desired for the following female evangelists. And these names here are listed. What's not obvious is that these are women who are associated with George Clegg's home in Halifax. But in the pages of the Joyful News now each week, we can see where every single one of these women was stationed and what they were doing. Then, for some reason, in 1892, Thomas Champness decides that he's going to set up his own female evangelist's home. We're not really sure why that is, but he decides to do this. So the two institutions sort of change names, and they separate ever so slightly. Thomas Champness, his group is eventually finds a base in Rugby. Again, the argument being that it was close to train networks, which made it easy for women to spread around the country. And but then, for again some unknown reason, in 1900, the home moves again, this time to Wellington in Shropshire. And this is kind of really, I suppose, the general narrative of what happens. In 1896, George Clegg suddenly dies, and this puts a spanner in the works for the Halifax home. And then in 1903, Thomas Champness, aging, his focus drifting elsewhere, retires from the work, and the Castleton home transfers to Cliff College in Derbyshire. In both cases, the future of female evangelism is unclear. So when we look at what these women were doing, I have about 10 minutes left, I think, to my time. I want to spend the last sort of 10 minutes really then talking about the women who were involved with these two homes and what we can say about them, and whether or not we can talk about them as an emerging profession. So the first category that I would like to look at is the issue of being qualified. And whether or not these women were, in fact, the middle-class women who were being called for. So are these women really professional evangelists or not? And I think this, and again, I put this up for a bit of light relief, but what I think it speaks to is, in fact, that by 1891, already you've got secular newspapers familiar with the trope of the female evangelist, familiar enough that they're prepared to make a joke about it and to play off on the obvious sexual tensions, that interacted there. And I think that that's really interesting. But if we go back seriously to look at the qualifications and whether or not the women who entered these homes fulfilled them or not, I come back to my favorite woman, Miss Sarah Catherine Rawlings Wilson, known only ever in the local press as SCR Wilson. Because if anybody was to be the epitome of the professional lay evangelist at this time, it would be her. She was born in Durham in Low Fell. Her father was a substantial builder, so much so that her brother didn't need to work, and the two of them both lived on the income that he had generated. But her father seems to have been involved in evangelism or missionary work of some time, and she occupies an independent preaching career that lasts from about 1882 to around about 1902. And she certainly represents the kind of woman that the Joyful News was after. And in 1886, she writes a letter to Joyful News where she appeals to the young ladies of Methodism and asks them to come forward. She's looking for daughters who could be spared from the home and would not require remuneration. Can we not, she asks, as stewardesses of our Lord's property, lay it out to better advantage than in fancy work and evening parties and the many other things over which women are frittering away their lives? She clearly gets lots of responses because several weeks later she writes again and says, actually, what I meant was young ladies with a fair amount of education and sound scriptural knowledge with means of their own who would not require any salary and would pay their own traveling expenses. The work would be to conduct a service and give a short gospel address every night in a chapel or hall. You'd then, during the day, be expected to visit, distribute gospel tracts, etc., and hold open-air meetings. She then offers to coordinate all of this activity herself and to put ladies who are interested in doing this kind of work in touch with circuits who were looking for them. Her efforts clearly don't come to anything. Thomas Champness seems to take, and George Clegg do something else instead. But nevertheless, what we can see here is this demand for for the middle-class, respectable woman who isn't going to be paid. In fact, I think that a lot of the women who joined the Joyful News Evangelist homes in the early days come from the ranks of the middling classes. Of course, there were a number whose fathers were from affluent backgrounds. One was a Wesleyan minister, one's father was a journalist, a retired police inspector, a substantial shepherd and farmer. But many others, fathers were shoemakers, upholsterers, a grocer, and some came from even more humble backgrounds. Susanna Cook's father, she was the superintendent of the Halifax home, was a farmer of only 75 acres. Mary Ann Coles, who Thomas Champness hires in 1903, had a father who was an agricultural laborer and had worked as a domestic servant before becoming an evangelist. So we can see how the qualifications are not quite the professional ideal that many were after. The same thing is true if we look at institutional affiliation. Contrary to expectation, Thomas Champness's and George Clegg's mission quickly gained conference approval. By 1889, the Home Missionary Committee had set Thomas apart for full-time lay work to run the mission. In 1892, connectional status is given to the mission and to Clegg's home as well. So by 1894, the conference notes then that the first report of the Joyful News mission has been recorded in the Blue Books. There are now 92 men and 25 women employed in the service of the mission, clearly seeing these women operating as some kind of an official body of the church. So it was clear that this institution had legs, was potentially going to go somewhere. It had the support of conference. But, as I think I've already suggested, both Halifax and the Rugby homes were vulnerable. George Clegg dies suddenly, unexpectedly, and his women evangelists disappear from the record. The Rugby home also seems to have struggled to have gained a solid foothold. It lacked a significant institutional base, for number one. When it starts, there is no home. And then the fact that it's based in Rugby and then later in Wellington also suggests to me that it's been organized at a distance, that it lacks it must have felt isolated, I think, far away from the center in Rochdale. And although Mary Champness, Thomas's daughter, is said to have been the superintendent of this home, I don't think she ever lived there. The census always returns her as living in Rochdale. So in this respect, I think the homes were vulnerable and lacked a solid institutional base. Now, if we look at payment, and we talk about payment, that's another way of looking at professionalism. And again, the ideal when it got started was that they wouldn't be paid, and that these women would give of their services, and that all that they would have would be their traveling expenses paid for. But the evidence clearly shows that female evangelism was something which women sought after because it was paid, and that there was some measure of support for it. This is Miss Wilson here in the local press, conducting a mission every night. So it's obvious that female evangelists were recognized. And here we can see from a range of different northern newspapers want ads looking for female evangelists. Wanted, a female evangelist for mission work. Wanted, female evangelist, one who is accustomed to open air preferred. Wanted, two female evangelists, one who can preach and the other a good singer. So we can see here that already we have this idea of and in fact in the upper right-hand corner is a respectable female evangelist offering her services. A great revivalist has had 6 years experience. Okay, so this is clearly not this kind of respectable, this is women looking for some sort of paid, secure role. So the final thing then is two things really, just to finish off with. One is length of service, because I also think that if we look at how long you've actually served for an organization, that can be an indication of if it's professional status. Neither of the two homes was open for very long. One for 9 years, the other one for probably around about 10. And when we look at the Halifax figures and statistics, it's fairly evenly distributed. About half of the women who enter the home leave within 6 months. Sorry, not half. A fifth leave within 6 months, but another fifth stay for the entire time, the whole 9 years. The Rugby home is bigger. There's more women who come and go. And it seems that about only 15% leave within the first 6 months. but only 7 of 85 or so women affiliated to the home actually stay for the full time. Far more of these women leave within about 2 to 3 years. And many of them, we know, leave to become members of the Wesley Deaconess Order. They leave to become foreign missionaries. But probably, I suspect, most of them left to become married. And these high attrition rates, I think, make it very difficult for a profession to sustain itself. There's just so much turnover. For a few women, then, becoming a professional female evangelist could be a lifetime career choice. But for others, it seems to have been something that they did when they were young and single, before they become married, perhaps as an alternative to a dull occupation. The average age of entry at the Rugby homes was significantly less than it was in Halifax. The Halifax homes age on entry was about 30. In Rugby, it was 23. So for many of these women, it's a short term, it's a temporary affiliation. It's not something that they're going to make a career out of. Ironically, it's the independents who are never associated with these homes, who we know of from the Joyful News paper, like Sarah Wilson, who are in fact really demonstrating that kind of career evangelism. So just to conclude then, what can we say? I think that we're really talking about the emergence of a new breed of female evangelist in the 1880s. A woman who was young, single, and frequently Methodist, and increasingly professional in many, many ways. Her ministry was endorsed and supported by a growing holiness movement and by wider changes in roles for women that were taking place within society as a whole. And I think, interestingly enough, I think Wesleyanism is pretty open to this movement and is prepared to support it. And that there is a body of opinion within the Wesleyan Church at the time who is prepared to offer a cautious support for this movement. Hugh Price Hughes is a powerful advocate for women in the late 19th century. He speaks repeatedly in favor of women's rights. And if you read his biography, his daughter devotes over 20 pages, which is a tiny amount, to his support for women. But Thomas Champness's wife, in her biography, devotes a single paragraph to the work of the female evangelists at Rugby. So you really get a sense, I think, of Hugh Price Hughes's role and where he sees women. And I'm sure that there were those who were sympathetic to what he was doing. But I don't think we can get away from the fact that these women and professional evangelism within Wesleyanism was extremely vulnerable, and that it was not yet the secure profession that perhaps full-time church work is in the 20th century. In 1911, I found Mary Champness working as the assistant secretary of the Birmingham Cripples Union. Susanna Cook, the former superintendent of the Halifax home, still now calls herself an evangelist and is living in Halifax. And so was able to sustain that career, but clearly not with any kind of wider institutional endorsement. As I said before, many others move on to other careers, and most, by far and away the majority, simply disappear and we don't see them again. So I think it's easy to adopt a conclusion of failed institutionalization. Here's an institution that just failed to happen. Maybe it's really easy as well to argue this is failed professionalism. Wesleyanism is not able to bring about a profession for lay women at this time. And I think you could probably argue, too, that it's also an example of the failed mobilization behind a campaign for ordination. This is not something which emerges from this movement, which I think is really interesting, because you would have thought that all of these women preaching on the ground would have been the place where a call for ordination might have come from. But on the other hand, I don't want to end on a negative note, because what I think these women did is deeply significant. Clearly, I think the Joyful News women build on a small but continued presence and acceptance of female preaching at a local grassroots level within Wesleyanism. And I think that likely they just simply disregarded the strictures of 1803 and the denominational prohibitions against their work. They certainly speak not at all in their defense, and they speak never in favor, really, of their work. But they did it, and it's recorded, and it sits there in the public domain. And they simply continued to act in the way that they felt called to do. And I think in so doing, their very presence, whether we can chart its outlines entirely or not, forces, I think, the boundaries of acceptable public ministry and the definition of who and who could not do it to be reconceived. So in that sense, we could argue that in 1910, when the Methodist Conference quietly modifies its position on female preaching, utterly overwhelmed that year by access of lay women to conference, we can perhaps see, and it lifts the ban after more than 100 years on female preaching. I think we can see really the influence potentially of these women, and that much of those early changes in Wesleyanism towards the role of women within ministry can be down to these women and their supporters. Thank you.